This is Selina Todd, reading from my book Tastes of Honey, The Making of Sheila Delaney and a Cultural Revolution, exclusively for Malcolms's. Chapter 1, Curtain Up. In April 1958, 19-year-old Sheila Delaney, the daughter of a Salford bus driver, sent a manuscript to Joan Littlewood, the director of London's avant-garde theatre workshop. Her covering note explained to Miss Littlewood that this bundle of thin, closely typed sheets of paper was her first play, A Taste of Honey. A fortnight ago, I didn't know the theatre existed, she claimed. But then, a young man, anxious to improve my mind, took me to the Opera House in Manchester, and I came away after the performance having suddenly realised that at last, after 19 years of life, I had discovered something that meant more to me than myself. The next day, she borrowed an unbelievable typewriter and set to and produced this little epic. Don't ask me why, I'm quite unqualified for anything like this. The story Sheila Delaney told to Joan Littlewood was only partly true. Her letter was a typically shrewd attempt to appeal to her audience, in this case by presenting herself as a naive northern ingenue. Even her signature was embellished. She called herself Sheila Delaney, spelling it with a GH at the end of Sheila, and that's the name that she will be known by for the rest of this book. Her spelling was a deliberate rejection of the identity of plain Sheila, spelt S-H-E-I-L-A, from Salford, and the future laid out for her. Sheila, with a GH, was a young woman ambitious to escape the life she'd been born into. But she was also determined to tell the stories of the women she left behind. A Taste of Honey was her first attempt, and arguably her best. Sheila's play focuses on Jo, a working-class teenager who lives in Salford with her single mother Helen, and who becomes a single mother herself as the result of a brief affair with a black sailor. Jo rages against her fate, but finds solace in her friendship with Jeff, a gay art student, who is keen to make a home for her and the baby. The play ends when Helen returns from a brief, failed marriage to find Jo's labour pains beginning. A Taste of Honey grabbed Joan Littlewood's attention. Working class people, if they appeared at all in books, films or plays in the 50s, were, as the Listener magazine said, comic or loyal, or more frequently both. For most audiences, these appearances provided the only glimpses of working class life they got. Stephen Frears was a 17-year-old public schoolboy in 1958, destined for Cambridge and a film career. They weren't people one knew, he said of the working class people depicted in A Taste of Honey. They were people you saw from the tops of buses. This situation was slowly changing. John Osborne's play Look Back in Anger, staged at the Royal Court in London in 1956, was the ripple that quickly turned into a new wave of novels, plays and films about a restless generation of young working-class upstarts. But the protagonists who wanted adventure, Joan Lampton in John Brayne's novel Room at the Top, published in 1957, or Arthur Seaton in Alan Sillitoe's Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, published in 1958, were all men. Women often held them back. One kiss and they were envisaging marriage. Pregnancy turned them into dutiful replicas of their mothers. Their biology determined they could do nothing else. Sheila Delaney was the first post-war playwright to suggest that these women had minds and desires of their own, a radical proposal in the 1950s. Motherhood is supposed to come natural to women, says Jeff in Sheila's play, voicing the standard medical opinion of the time. Pregnancy was meant to render women docile and maternity to fulfil them. Advertisers, educators, policymakers and psychologists told women that they were luckier than their mothers. The post-war welfare state and affluence brought about by full employment, rendered their lives both easier and more fulfilling. Clad in new-look dresses, they could spend their lives making happy homes for their hard-working husbands and their healthy children, the citizens of Britain's brave new future. But this was a life that Sheila showed was beyond thousands of women who, like Jo and Helen, continued to live in overcrowded slums. Even more radically, she suggested it was a life that they did not want. More than a decade before the women's liberation movement emerged in Britain, Sheila Delaney created characters who challenged the assumption that women found fulfilment in marriage and motherhood. Neither Jo nor Helen is satisfied by being a wife or mother. For Helen, motherhood and marriage present at least as many burdens as joys. Jo, meanwhile, rages against her body and her fate. In a world that told working class women they should be grateful for anything they got, Jo and Helen openly longed for a taste of honey, craving love, creativity, adventure and escape. In a telegram to her new protégée, Joan Littlewood announced that her company, Theatre Workshop, would stage A Taste of Honey as their next production at the Theatre Royal, Stratford East. Sheila was present for the premiere on the 27th of May 1958. Theatre Workshop had a reputation for courting controversy, but neither Joan nor Jerry Raffles, her theatre manager, had any idea how Sheila's play would be received. Raffles warned Francis Cooker and Murray Melvin, the actors playing Jo and Jeff, to be ready to run from the stage if the audience turned abusive when they took their curtain call. When the curtain fell on that Tuesday evening, there was a moment's stunned silence, and then the audience roared their approval. Within days, Honey was a hit, and Sheila, the most famous teenager in Britain. Over the next 3 weeks, hundreds of people flocked to Stratford East to watch an extraordinary episode in British theatre history. A story of slums, sexual politics and race relations, A Taste of Honey caught Britain on the cusp of change. At a time when Conservative Prime Minister Harold Macmillan was claiming people had never had it so good, reactions to the play exposed a deep social chasm. Almost all the press condemned Honey as tasteless muck. Even those reviewers who enjoyed it betrayed their amazement that such apparently moronic people can be so moving, as Dennis Konstandouros, sent from the BBC's drama department to see what all the fuss was about, put it. But theatre-goers from working-class Stratford did not agree. Norman Rimmel, who worked at the local co-op, thought the play was groundbreaking, but in his words, it wasn't particularly controversial. Sheila depicted a life with which he and his wife were familiar. Builders, labourers and office workers told a BBC News crew that Honey was about people like us, isn't it? Real life. Honey turned Sheila Delaney into a celebrity. The burning question posed by journalists, fans and most of the arts establishment was how a working-class teenage girl from Salford could write such a shattering play. For Sheila came from the place she wrote about, much to the horror and prurient fascination of her critics. The Spectator declared that Honey's only redeeming feature was that it is not scholarly anthropology observed from the outside, but the inside story of a savage culture observed by a genuine cannibal. By the late 1950s, there were quite a lot of outsiders peering at the working class, but Sheila was different. She wasn't, as some critics would imply, a single mother or a prostitute, but she'd grown up in an area where women were independent. Many worked for a living. Some were widowed or had been deserted by their husbands. Some sold their bodies, and some babies were black. In fact, the north of England, as she presented it, looked a lot more eclectic than supposedly bohemian Bloomsbury. Her working class background set Sheila apart from the few other women playwrights emerging in the late 50s. Angelico had seen her play, The Sport of My Mad Mother, premiere at the Royal Court in London just weeks before Honey's debut. The story of a juvenile gang, the play explored relations between young men and women growing up with little hope for the future. But Jellicoe's work was grounded in improvisation. She saw herself as a director as well as a writer, and hers was an outsider's view of working class life. She had had a boarding school education before training at the Central School of Speech and Drama, and The Sport of My Mad Mother has a narrator who is detached from the juvenile gang he observes. By the time Honey became a film in 1961, a group of women writers were beginning to explore the frustrations and desires of highly educated girls of Sheila's generation. But most of these writers, like their protagonists, were middle class. In asserting that working class women deserved their own voice in the theatre, as playwrights and as subjects of plays, A Taste of Honey was unique.